It's raining outside and it is the end of October. Why is someone mowing? Maybe they're leaf blowing. Hello and welcome to my channel if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, but if it is not, welcome back. Today, as you can tell by the title of the video, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, which I read back in August now, but The Tainted Cup is holding one of the top spots for best book of the year for me so far. So I did want to film a little book review and get it up before the end of the year. Before I dive into my thoughts, however, I have made myself a distilled cocktail pairing for today's video, and I have made myself a maple bourbon old fashioned by quite simply just subbing out where I would typically put a simple syrup or some sugar with maple syrup, and then I put in a cinnamon stick to garnish because this just feels quintessentially autumn. It is gray and drizzly and a little bit dreary outside today, so this feels like the perfect comfort cocktail, and I already know it's going to be good. It smells delicious. So cheers. Yeah, I don't know if it is just me being stereotypically Canadian or what, but maple syrup in an old fashioned is so good, and I would absolutely recommend that you give this a try if you haven't already. It is so good and it smells just delicious. But also because I am who I am, I have made myself a coffee to go along with today's video. So I hope that you make yourself a comforting beverage to go along with today's video as well. And without further ado, let's finally dive into my thoughts. So The Tainted Cup is the first book in the Shadow of the Leviathan series, and it's actually the first book by Bennett that I've ever read, but it came out a few years ago now. So the second installment in this series is already out. It came out last year, and the third book is scheduled for publication in June of 2026, but that obviously might change between now and then. But this is a high fantasy murder mystery series. It's very reminiscent to the traditional detective novels like Sherlock and Watson or like Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, I would say. That's how I first heard it described on BookTube, and that's what garnered my interest. That comparison to Sherlock Holmes is what immediately hooked me, and now having read the book, that is very much what this book is reminiscent of, with our main characters, with their dynamic, and also just with how the story plays out and the way that Bennett tells his mystery. However, unlike those traditional murder mysteries, this is an alternative high fantasy in which the world we are in is the Empire of Hanam, and it is very, very reminiscent to ancient China or Japan. It's an Asiatic-inspired world that has steampunk vibes or like biopunk vibes with body modifications that take place through scientific kind of experiments on the human body. But then in contrast to that very developed scientific front, you have much more rural ways of life. So there is that contrast that feels very steampunk-esque. And personally, I really love that vibe in books. I love that contrast. So this is something that worked really well for me. And just in general, I really enjoyed this world. The book begins very abruptly, and the reader is kind of thrown into things. So if you're not someone who gets on well with that, you may struggle to find your feet. I definitely had to grapple for several chapters of the book to try and find my feet, to try and kind of adjust my expectations for this world, because I had gone into it with Sherlock and Watson expectations. But once I was able to orient myself, I really, really enjoyed this world as well, because the reader is kind of thrown into things and just has to kind of roll with the punches and learn as you go. I found Bennett's world building to be very authentic and natural feeling. There weren't massive world dumps right out of the gate, which is a massive feat when you are orienting your reader in such an unfamiliar and at times unique world. But like, we don't learn about the roads that lead to the capital or anything like that until our main characters are quite literally on the road traveling to someplace. And that's when we learn more about the sea walls and how the empire is structured and what this threat is of something potentially breaching the sea wall. The way that Bennett peppered little bits of the world building throughout really impressed me and makes me eager to learn even more in the second and third book when it finally comes out. As well, in addition to throwing readers into the thick of things in terms of the plot and the characters and the world building, Bennett also throws readers right into the thick of things from the first chapter. Those first few chapters are very graphic and very gruesome and grotesque, with the description of blood and a corpse and just general body horror. Body horror is not something that I typically get too squeamish about, but I was trying to start reading The Tainted Cup before bed, and I had to stop and start a few times because it was just so detailed that it definitely made me a little bit queasy. So a content warning for the whole book, but especially the introduction for blood and body horror and the graphic descriptions of both. It was still a very strong introduction, and with the benefit of hindsight and a little bit of distance, I think it is just such an impactful introduction to the series, to the characters, to the world, to all of that. I really appreciate that introduction, but it did take me a few times to get through. And then just one final note about like the overall book of some things that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the neurodivergent representation in our characters. Obviously, it's not labeled or named in ways that would be familiar to us because this is an alternative reality. It is a fantasy setting. But the way that the characters behave bears a lot of resemblance to people who would be on the neurodivergent spectrum in our modern day. And I just love that representation in all of my books, but especially fantasy and especially romance, because it doesn't often occur within those alternate universes. So I really enjoyed Bennett's inclusion for Anna and Din. Then speaking of Anna and Din, there are a handful of characters that feature throughout the book that are quite relevant and prominent to the plot, but this book really focuses on Din and on Anna. They are our main characters. They fulfill the trope of detective and assistant like Sherlock and Watson or Poirot and Hastings. That is Anna and Din. The book is told through the perspective of Din. He is our narrator, which is very similar to Hastings or Watson in those traditional detective novels. And I was always going to love Din. Almost without fail, if you present me with a gangly, slightly awkward, slightly self-tortured character who is well-meaning and flawed, I'm going to want to adopt them. I'm going to want to love them and have them realize their own self-worth. And that is who Din was for me. I absolutely fell in love with his character so early on, and I just wanted to kind of bundle him up and give him a big hug. Anna, on the other hand, did take me a little bit longer to warm up to. She is very persnickety. She is very similar to the traditional Sherlock, the canon Sherlock character, who is a little bit abrasive, who doesn't mince words. And I wouldn't say that Anna is unempathetic. I think she does have empathy within this book. It's featured, it's there, but she just isn't empathy forward with most people most of the time. She kind of has blinders on and is hyper focused on what is in front of her. She's trying to achieve her objective, and she doesn't always consider other people's emotions as she's going through those motions for her own objective, although sometimes I think she needles other people on purpose and she is fully aware of what she is doing. But that also delighted me. By the time that those instances were occurring, I truly cared for Anna and for Din. I loved their banter. They had such good banter as they grew more comfortable with one another. And throughout the book, there were instances of witty, dry humor or black humor that I think added needed levity to these at times very graphic, gruesome, and brutal descriptions. As I have already said, and as this is a murder mystery novel, the book opens with a murder, and it is one of those seemingly impossible murders. Din is sent to this manor house that is owned by this rich and powerful family within the empire. And Anna sends him to investigate this murder and to be her eyes and ears because Din has undergone medical enhancements to become an engraver within this realm. And this is part of the biotech that I might have mentioned beforehand. But so everything that Din sees and hears and smells and just observes, he can recollect with perfect detail. So he goes to observe this murder scene, to observe the staff of this manor house, and report back to Anna so that she can begin parsing through what she thinks might have taken place. Their investigation then leads them to the outskirts of the empire, to what is kind of like a military outpost city along the sea wall. And throughout the Tainted Cup, there are multiple levels of mystery. I would say there are three main mysteries throughout the book. The first one pertains to this murder and the subsequent fallout and determining who killed this man and who is trying to wreak this havoc, and if perhaps this powerful family is involved and if there's any government corruption perhaps involved. The second mystery is then a personal mystery regarding Din, because throughout the narration we begin to learn that Din is hiding something. He's very secretive about a certain aspect of his past. He describes the shame that he feels, and it's slowly being revealed throughout the course of the novel what he is so ashamed and afraid of others learning about him. And then the third mystery within the Tainted Cup that doesn't really become a main focus of the book at any point is the fact that the empire is protected by these sea walls. And in the sea, there are these giant monsters, these leviathans, that are trying to breach the seawall. And if they manage to breach the seawall, and if they aren't killed by the military who are defending the empire, they can then go straight for the capital and kind of wreak havoc and destroy the countryside, kill thousands of individuals and citizens. They are truly, truly massive, ginormous creatures, these leviathans. And even though the threat of Leviathan attack is one that is prevalent throughout the Tainted Cup and very, very real, it does not register in the top two priorities throughout the course of the book. But I think Bennett has set the series up well, that those Leviathans and the greater inner workings of the empire, the politics, the potential corruption, the way it's all set up and its history too. I think that's going to become more prevalent in the second book and perhaps the third. So I'm very eager to learn more and to finally read the sequel, hopefully soon. And because of that potential corruption that I was talking about, there are roadblocks that are standing in the way of Anna and Din properly and fully investigating what took place at the manor house and what's taking place in this military outpost. There are folks who do not want Anna and Din to cleanly and fairly close out their investigation. They'd much prefer for them to just kind of wipe their hands and walk away from things, which is not on the table for Anna and Din. But because of that, there is a lot of tension when they arrive in this city, and there's a lot of questioning who they can trust. So loyalty and truth and trust are very big themes throughout the course of this book, and those are themes that I always enjoy in my reading, and especially in fantasy, because I think those themes can play out really interestingly within fantasy realms. As well, another aspect that I love within all of my books is humor, and there is a lot of dry, witty humor throughout the Tainted Cup. There's also a lot of black humor, which is something that I love, and I think that it is almost necessary in a book like this, which can be a little bit cut and dry with the grotesque descriptions and with the, at times, militaristic way of depicting events. I think that humor really cut through the text and added a necessary levity, and it would be like in the thick of things and I'd find myself laughing at a particular line or bits of dialogue between the two characters. So that's something that I always really enjoy. Another aspect that made the first book in the Shadow of the Leviathan series feel like a Sherlock and Watson novel or feel like a Poirot novel is the 11th hour reveals. It felt like punch after punch after punch in those final few chapters. The last, I was going to say 10%, but perhaps even less than that. The last few chapters just contained so many reveals, and ones that I hadn't thought we were going to see fully come to fruition. And I do enjoy when a mystery kind of ends in that vein. I think because I grew up reading Poirot and I love the way that Poirot does his monologues at the end, that kind of puts everything in its place and answers all of the questions that you may have. Anna does something very, very similar in a similarly dramatic fashion that had me like giggling and like just so excited for that moment. It was epic. It was very, very well done by Bennett. And it also just had me thinking of Sanderson's line that there's always another secret, because it did truly feel throughout this book, and especially towards the tail end, that there is always another secret. There is always some other working in the background that's interfering and affecting the plot. And I mean that in the highest compliment. Obviously, I really enjoyed The Tainted Cup. I've already said that. I've already said that it's in the running for one of my best books of the year. I did only give it 4.5 stars because I didn't connect with the plot and the world right away. And that is a personal failing, obviously, but a review is a personal reflection on a read. And I just didn't immediately find myself in the snares of The Tainted Cup. So I gave it a 4.5 star rating, which is still a very high rating for a book. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the banter. I enjoyed the characters. I think the conclusion was very well done. Bennett wraps up most of the plot points within The Tainted Cup. that first tier of the murder mystery is wrapped up with a few lingering questions. He addresses the mystery surrounding Din and what he is potentially ashamed of. And he sets things up very beautifully for the third tier of what is going on with the larger empire and these leviathans who are trying to breach the seawall. He sets all of that up to segue very nicely, I expect, in the second book. So I think the conclusion was well done. The world building was very well done. But because I did not find myself fully in the snares of the book from page 1, that's why I knocked off that half-star rating. Because of the abrupt and very graphic beginning, it did take me longer to get into this book than usual. I would say I didn't fully find myself enamored, and this book didn't have its claws in me until about a third, or maybe even slightly more than a third of the way in. It wasn't until that point where finally my reading pace kind of picked up and matched what my normal reading pace is, which tends to be quite quickly. So whenever it takes me longer than a week or a week and a half to finish a book, I know that there was just something missing that wasn't quite right for me personally. And so that's why I gave this 4.5 stars. However, I will absolutely be picking up the second book. So those are my thoughts on The Tainted Cup. Let me know down below in a comment if you have read The Tainted Cup and what your thoughts were, because I'd love to hear them. For now, this is going to be it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will be back soon with a new one. Bye for now.